I was ordered to observe humans in battle. Now I know we cannot win. Vale Kor had never been given an assignment he cared less about. He stood in the long gray corridor of the Dravathi Intelligence Hall on the station above Vel Prime, holding a thin assignment file in his four-fingered hand, reading the same 2 lines for the 3rd time. He was being sent to observe humans. Not the Sarvan fleet, which had destroyed 4 Dravathi observation posts in the last cycle. Not the Korath border expansion, which every senior officer in the building was scrambling to document. Humans, the young, noisy, short-lived species from a single wet planet in a small and unremarkable star system. He walked into Counselor Thon's office without knocking, which was allowed only for officers of his rank, and set the file flat on the desk. He was a tall Dravathi, older than most of the furniture in the room, with pale silver skin and the slow movements of someone who had not been in a hurry for several hundred years. He turned a page of whatever he was reading, and finally raised his eyes. "You have read the file," he said. "I have," Vale Kor said. "I would like to understand why." Thon leaned back in his chair and folded his hands. "The humans have engaged the Vethkai Dominion in a border dispute near the Kepler expansion zone. The Vethkai have requested observer neutrality under the Alden Accords. We are sending you to observe." "The Vethkai will destroy them in under a week," Vale Kor said. "I will be on a ship full of beings who are about to lose a war they do not yet understand they are in." "Then your report will be short," Thon said, and looked back down at his page. "The humans are listed as Class 3 in the archive. Primitive biological, high emotional volatility, low strategic ceiling. There is nothing in that file that should concern you. Go, observe, return, write what you see." Vale Kor picked up the file. He wanted to say something else, but Thon had already forgotten he was in the room. He left. The transport to the human ship took 4 days. Vale Kor spent most of it reviewing what the Dravathi archive actually contained about humanity, which was not very much. They had been a spacefaring species for just under 200 years. They reproduced quickly, aged quickly, and died quickly. Their technology was functional, but not elegant. Their political structures were complicated and often contradictory. They had a long recorded history of fighting each other over things the archive described as territory, belief systems, and limited resources, which Vale Kor found both familiar and slightly exhausting to read about. The one detail that stuck with him was a note added by a Dravathi observer 40 years earlier, during humanity's first contact period. The note said simply, "They do not behave as a species that understands its own limitations." The observer had meant it as a criticism. Vale Kor was not sure yet what he meant by it himself. The transport docked with the UES Iron Gate in open space, near the edge of what the humans called the Kepler Corridor. The Iron Gate was a destroyer-class ship, long and angular, and slightly scarred along the port side from something recent. It did not look impressive. It looked used. The docking port opened, and a human in a dark uniform was waiting on the other side. He was a man of middle age, not especially tall, with a face that had spent time in difficult weather, and a pair of steady gray eyes that looked at Vale Kor without surprise or discomfort. Most humans, in Vale Kor's limited experience, found Dravathi unsettling to look at. This one simply extended his hand in the human greeting gesture. "Captain Aaron Briggs," the man said, "welcome aboard the Iron Gate. We were told you'd be joining us." Vale Kor performed the handshake as he had studied it. "Vale Kor, Dravathi Intelligence. I am here only to observe. I will not interfere with your operations." Briggs nodded. "Understood. I'll have someone show you your quarters. Dinner's at 1800 if you eat." That was the entire welcome. Briggs turned and walked back down the corridor with the unhurried pace of someone he had a great deal to do, and intended to do all of it without rushing. Vale Kor followed the crew member assigned to him, and noted in his mind that the captain had asked no questions, made no attempt at political conversation, and had not once looked at Vale Core the way most beings looked at an intelligence observer, with careful, performed indifference. Briggs had simply seemed genuinely unbothered. It was unusual. The crew of the Iron Gate was introduced to Vale Core over the course of that first day, some formally and some not. Lieutenant Commander Dana Reyes was the weapons officer, a lean woman in her mid-30s, with quick eyes and a habit of talking faster when she was thinking hard. She shook his hand, said "Good to meet you," and immediately turned back to the display she had been working on, which Vale Core noted was a firing solution diagram for a 3-target engagement. She was already planning for a fight that had not happened yet. Chief Engineer Lou Garza met him in the engine corridor, a heavy-set man with grease on his forearm and a coffee cup that appeared to be a permanent attachment to his left hand. He gave Vale Core a tour of the engine room, with the easy pride of someone showing off a home they had built themselves. He spoke about the ship's reactor the way Dravathi engineers spoke about mathematical proofs, with deep, personal affection. Vale Core asked him how old the ship was. Garza said 12 years, and smiled like that was a compliment. Corporal Nadia Holloway was the first of the Marine detachment he met, and she was the youngest person on the ship who carried the particular stillness of someone trained for violence. She was 22 years old, according to the file he had been given, and she had 2 commendations already on her record. She nodded at Vale Core with the comfortable directness of someone who had learned early not to waste energy on first impressions, and then went back to checking her equipment with calm, methodical hands. The ship's doctor, Calvin Marsh, was the only one who offered him something before saying anything else. The man appeared in the doorway of the medical bay as Vale Core passed it, holding out a white cup and saying "coffee" with the same tone someone might use to offer a handshake. Vale Core did not drink coffee. He said so. Marsh said "fair enough" and drank it himself, and then asked with genuine curiosity what Dravathi observers usually ate. They talked for 20 minutes. It was the longest conversation Vale Core had on the ship that first day. That night, sitting in the small and functional quarters assigned to him, Vale Core opened his mission log and wrote his first entry. He wrote that the humans on the Iron Gate did not behave like a crew preparing for combat. They did not carry the sharp collective focus that a Dravathi ship had before engagement. They moved through their routines the same way they would have moved through a quiet day. They talked to each other about small things. They laughed sometimes in the corridors. Garza had been humming something in the engine room. Marsh had left a cup of coffee sitting on a counter in the medical bay, going cold because he had gotten caught in a conversation. Vale Core wrote, "These beings have not yet understood that the war is already here. Or perhaps they have understood it completely, and they have simply decided that it does not change how they intend to live until it arrives." He was not sure which possibility was more strange. He closed the log and sat in the quiet of the Iron Gate as it moved through the dark. And somewhere in the decks below him, someone was still humming. "I was ordered to observe humans in battle. Now I know we cannot win." The Iron Gate spent 6 days in repair transit before reaching the staging area near the Varan corridor. 6 days of reduced speed, skeleton shifts, and the particular silence that settles over a ship after it has been in a fight and knows another is coming. Vale Core had expected the crew to spend that time in focused preparation, weapons checks, tactical reviews, command briefings. All of that happened. But it was not the whole of what happened, and the rest of it was what Vale Core found himself writing about most. He had been ordered to observe humans in battle. But battle, he was beginning to understand, was only the surface of the thing. What was underneath it was harder to measure and impossible to ignore. He began with Calvin Marsh, because Marsh was the first one he could not explain. On the second night after the battle, Vale Core was walking the lower corridor of the ship. He had taken to walking at night, when the crew was thinner, and he could observe without feeling like a disruption. When he passed the open door of a small common room, Marsh was inside, sitting across from a young crew member named Greg, who was 19 years old, and had been a gunner's mate for 8 months. Greg had been on duty near the section where the 2 crew members were killed. He was staring at the table between his hands, and not speaking. Marsh was not speaking either. He was simply there, sitting in the same quiet that Greg was sitting in, a cup of coffee at his elbow going cold. He did not offer advice. He did not give a medical assessment. He did not try to direct the young man's attention toward anything more comfortable. He just stayed. Vale Kor watched from the doorway for a while, long enough to see that nothing was happening, and that something important was happening at the same time. When he finally moved on, he noted in his log that Marsh had been in that room for over 2 hours. By the end of it, when Marsh finally stood and said goodnight, and the young man said goodnight back, Greg looked different than he had at the beginning. Not healed, but less alone. Vale Kor wrote, "I observed no medical function being performed. There was no treatment, no diagnosis, no intervention, and yet the doctor clearly understood that his presence was the treatment. I do not have a word for this in my language. I am using the human word, companionship." Dana Reyes did not slow down in the days after the battle. She ran weapons drills the morning after, before the repairs on the main cannon were even finished, using the secondary systems. She pushed her team harder than the regulation schedule required, and never explained why. Though Vale Kor suspected she didn't need to, her team could see the same tactical projections she could, and they knew what was waiting at the Varan corridor. But on the 4th day of the transit, a junior officer named Ben came to Reyes just before his duty shift, and quietly told her that his wife had gone into labor back on Earth. The communication delay across the distance was severe. He might not be able to get through. Reyes looked at him for a second, then told him she would take his shift. He started to protest. She waved it off in that fast, dismissive way she had, and told him to go to the communications bay and stay there until he got through. When he came back, his face had a particular expression on it. Something between exhaustion and relief, and a kind of overwhelming private joy. And Reyes looked at him once, nodded, and handed him his station back, without making anything of it. Vale Kor had been watching from his observation post. He noted in his log that Reyes had run back-to-back shifts in the 48 hours prior, and had been awake for 19 hours by the time she covered Ben's shift. He noted that she did this without being asked, and without expecting recognition for it. He wrote, "She is building something, every day, in the space between herself and the people beside her. I think this is what humans call loyalty." I had read the word. I had not seen it in practice until now. Lou Garza was the one who made Vale Kor feel the most unsettled, in the way that a thing can unsettle you not because it is frightening, but because it is completely outside your ability to predict. On the 5th day, Vale Kor asked Garza if he could observe the engine room work for a few hours. Garza said sure, handed him a cup of coffee by reflex, then looked briefly embarrassed when he remembered that Vale Kor didn't drink coffee. Vale Kor took the cup anyway, and held it, which seemed to satisfy some social requirement he didn't fully understand. What he watched over the next 3 hours was a man doing things with limited materials and a partially damaged system that produced results the system was not designed to produce. Garza did not follow procedure in the strict sense. He followed something more like intuition, a deep, intimate knowledge of the machine that let him find solutions in places the manual did not list solutions. When Vale Kor asked him how he knew a particular rerouting fix would hold, Garza scratched the back of his neck and said he wasn't sure it would, but that it was the best option available. So he was going to believe in it and see. "You are going to believe in it," Vale Kor repeated. "Sure," Garza said, as if this were a normal engineering strategy. Half of keeping a ship running is just refusing to let it fall apart. Veilcore wrote in his log, Chief Engineer Garza appears to treat certainty as a resource that can be generated by will. Dravathi engineering operates on verified probabilities. Garza operates on something I can only describe as chosen faith in outcome. The disturbing part is that it works. PHR. Nadia Holloway was teaching 2 younger Marines a close combat technique in the small training bay on the 6th morning, when Veilcore stopped to watch. She moved with the economy of someone who had been trained past the point of thinking about movement. Everything she did was already decided by the body before the mind caught up. She was laughing while she demonstrated a takedown that looked painful and probably was. Her students were laughing too, which seemed to help them learn faster. Veilcore waited until there was a break and asked her something that had been sitting with him since the battle. Are you afraid before combat? She looked at him with mild surprise, then nodded. Yeah, every time. But you went across to the colony ship during active fire without being ordered to. Those people needed help, she said, but you were afraid. She thought about that for a second, like she was genuinely puzzling through something she had not needed to examine before. Then she said, being afraid doesn't mean you don't go. It just means you know what's happening. She picked up her practice staff and went back to her students. Veilcore stood at the doorway of the training bay and felt the specific discomfort of a being whose entire framework for understanding courage had just been quietly taken apart and left on the floor. He went back to his quarters and wrote for a long time. The Dravathi measured strength by what was removed from a soldier: fear, doubt, emotional attachment, personal investment. A Dravathi warrior at peak function was a clean instrument. They had spent centuries perfecting this model. Holloway was afraid. Marsh was emotionally attached to every person on the ship. Reyes made personal decisions that had nothing to do with tactical efficiency. Garza believed in things he couldn't verify. And Briggs, their captain, had sailed into a fight he might not survive because 40,000 strangers were his. None of them were clean instruments. Every single one of them was compromised, in the Dravathi sense of the word, loaded down with feeling and attachment and the specific weight of caring about the person standing next to them. And they were, Veilcore was slowly realizing, the most dangerous crew he had ever observed. He wrote, "We have spent a long time believing that the removal of weakness makes a soldier strong. These humans have shown me something different. They carry everything: their fear, their grief, their love, their stubbornness. And they fight with all of it at once. I am not sure we have a word for what that makes them. I am not sure we have anything that can match it." He closed the log and sat in the hum of the ship and waited for the Varen corridor. I was ordered to observe humans in battle. Now I know we cannot win. On the 3rd day aboard the Iron Gate, the alarms went off. Veilcore had been sitting at the small desk in his quarters, updating his mission log with observations about crew behavior patterns, when the sound cut through the ship like a blade. It was not a subtle alarm. It was loud and continuous, and it changed the air in the corridor outside his door immediately. He could hear footsteps, fast and certain, moving in every direction at once. He closed his log, stood, and made his way to the observation post that Captain Briggs had assigned him near the back of the bridge. The bridge of the Iron Gate was not large. It was a tight, functional space, with stations arranged in a half-circle around the captain's chair. Every screen lit, and every seat filled within seconds of the alarm sounding. Veilcore had observed military command centers before, on 4 different worlds. He had always found them to be places of controlled noise. Officers reporting, commanders issuing orders, the whole structure of authority moving in one direction at a time. The Iron Gate's bridge was different. Everyone was already talking, and no one seemed to be waiting for permission to act. Dana Reyes was at her weapons station before Vale Kor had fully settled into his observation position. Her fingers were moving across her display, and she was already talking. 4 HFY corvettes, 1 heavy cruiser, bearing 317. They've got a convoy pinned, looks like colony ships, 7 of them, civilian configuration. Briggs sat down in his chair in the same unhurried way he did everything. How many people on those ships? Reyes pulled up a reading. Transponder data puts it at roughly 40,000. Kepler outer settlements, heading for the transit point. The number settled over the bridge. Vale Kor noted the way the crew processed it. Not with visible panic, but with something that changed the set of their faces. A kind of weight coming down and being accepted. Briggs looked at the tactical display for a few seconds. 1 heavy cruiser and 4 corvettes against a single destroyer. The mathematics were not complicated. Vale Kor had already run the calculation in his head and arrived at a clear answer. He had begun mentally composing the section of his report where he would explain that humans responded to impossible odds with rational self-preservation behavior. He was certain that Briggs was about to order the ship to hold position and call for reinforcements. Briggs said, "Take us in, all ahead full." Vale Kor stopped writing the mental report. For a half second, no one on the bridge spoke. Then Reyes said, "Aye, all ahead full." Lou Garza's voice came through the comm from the engine room, calm as a man reading the weather. "I heard it. Giving you everything she has." What followed was 47 minutes that Vale Kor would spend the rest of his career trying to adequately describe in language. The Iron Gate did not approach the HFY formation carefully. It came in hard and fast, and Reyes began firing before they were at what any tactical manual would consider optimal range. Vale Kor understood the logic almost immediately. She was not trying to destroy the HFY ships from distance. She was trying to make them pay attention to the Iron Gate instead of the colony vessels. She was making the destroyer a problem that could not be ignored, forcing the HFY cruiser to turn and respond while the colony ships had time to scatter. It worked. It also meant that the Iron Gate was now absorbing fire from 5 enemy ships at once. The bridge shook, twice, then again harder. A display on the far left cracked and went dark. Someone reported a hull breach in Section 7. Garza was already shouting through the comm about rerouting power, and Vale Kor could hear him doing things in the engine room that the ship's own systems were flagging as safety violations. Garza ignored every warning with the focused energy of a man who had decided the warnings were someone else's problem right now. Reyes fought the way she planned, fast, precise, and with a willingness to take risks that made Vale Kor's translators struggle to find the right Dravathi words for what he was watching. She fired into gaps that were only gaps for fractions of a second. She targeted the HFY corvettes in a sequence that drew them into each other's firing lines. She was doing in real time, under pressure, with a damaged ship, what most tacticians would need an hour and a full planning table to even attempt. And then Vale Kor noticed something else happening that had nothing to do with the main battle. On a side screen, a small signal tracked the movement of Marines from the Iron Gate's lower decks. He asked the officer nearest him what he was seeing. The officer, a young man named Pete, said without looking up, "Corporal Holloway took a team across to Colony Ship 4. They've got a hull breach of their own and about 300 people trapped in a lower section. She went to get them out." Vale Kor processed this. Nadia Holloway had taken a boarding team across open space in the middle of an active battle to evacuate civilians from a ship that was not theirs, without being ordered to. The marker showing her team was moving steadily through the colony ship's schematics. He looked at Briggs. The captain was watching his screens with the same quiet expression he always wore, giving short commands, making adjustments, holding everything together with the kind of calm that Vale Kor now understood was not the absence of awareness. It was the result of someone who had decided before the battle started exactly what they were willing to lose and what they were not. The battle ended not with a decisive blow, but with a breaking point. One of the HFY corvettes was destroyed. Another was crippled. The heavy cruiser, having taken more damage than it expected from a single destroyer, pulled back. The remaining corvettes followed. The colony ships, scattered and shaken, were intact, all 7 of them. The Iron Gate had lost 2 crew members, a young woman named Kara and a man named Pete, who had been standing next to Vale Core 20 minutes earlier. Vale Core noted the names without knowing why he felt that he should. Later, when the immediate repair work had been organized and the ship had settled into the quiet of the aftermath, Vale Core found Briggs sitting on the floor of the corridor outside the medical bay. Not injured, just sitting, with his back against the wall, and his eyes on nothing in particular. Vale Core stood beside him for a moment, and then asked the question he needed answered. Why did you engage? The odds were not in your favor. The logical course was to hold and call for support. Briggs looked up at him slowly. He seemed to think about the question seriously, as though it deserved a serious answer. Then he said, because they were ours. He said nothing else. He did not explain what he meant by it. He did not seem to feel that it required explanation. Vale Core stood in the corridor for a long time after Briggs went back inside. He opened his log and wrote the words down exactly as they had been said. He did not add any analysis. He did not know what analysis to add. For the first time in a very long career, a 3-word answer had left him without a response. He closed the log. The Iron Gate continued moving through the dock. I was ordered to observe humans in battle. Now I know we cannot win. The Varen Corridor was a narrow channel of navigable space between 2 dense asteroid fields, and it was the only practical route between the HFY Dominion's staging ground and the human outer settlements. Whoever held the corridor held the approach. The HFY had understood this for months. The humans had understood it just as long. What neither side had yet established was who was willing to pay the most to keep it. Vale Core arrived at the staging area with the Iron Gate and found 13 other human ships already holding position. 14 ships in total. He pulled up the intelligence summary his own people had provided and checked the HFY numbers. 61 warships of various classes, including 6 heavy cruisers, assembled on the far side of the corridor. The summary had been flagged by 3 different Dravathi analysts as a situation with a predicted human survival probability of 11%. He sent a brief update to Counselor Thon. Thon responded in 4 words, observe and come home. Vale Core did not respond to that. He sat in his observation posts on the Iron Gate's bridge and waited. The human fleet commanders had gathered for a briefing earlier that day. Vale Core had been permitted to observe it, which he suspected was because Briggs did not particularly care either way. The briefing was held over a shared communication channel between all 14 ships, and the commanding admiral, a woman named Grace Okafor, aboard the lead vessel, ran it with a directness that Vale Core found brisk even by his own culture's standards. There was a general objective: hold the corridor, deny the HFY passage, protect the settlements behind them, and each captain was given a zone and a role. After that, the channel was filled with something that surprised him: the captains talking to each other in short, practical bursts, adjusting the plan between themselves, raising problems and proposing solutions without waiting for the admiral to direct them. It looked, to Vale Core's trained eye, like a meeting that was barely under control. He noted this in his log with concern. Dravathi Fleet Command was rigidly hierarchical for a reason. Unified direction prevented error, reduced redundancy, and ensured that decisions were made by the most qualified minds. What the humans were doing instead appeared to be a version of organized conversation. Everyone contributing, everyone adjusting to everyone else in real time. he would revise his concern later. The HFY came through the corridor at dawn by ship clock, which meant the long sensors picked them up first as dense clusters of heat signature and drive output. 61 ships, moving in a wide formation. The heavy cruisers at the center, and the smaller attack vessels spread out ahead of them like a loosened fist. Veilcore checked his figures again, 61 to 14. He was carrying enough emergency survival equipment to last 30 days if the ship was destroyed around him. He had quietly confirmed this the night before. What happened next changed the way he thought about every battle he had ever studied. The human fleet did not form a defensive line. They spread. Each ship moved to a different position, some of them appearing, to Veilcore's initial reading, to be fleeing in opposite directions. The HFY formation responded the way any sensible military force would. They pushed forward, assuming the disorganized scatter meant panic or confusion. It was not panic, it was positioning. Veilcore watched it develop, with the specific feeling of someone who has been looking at a piece of information the wrong way and has just turned it over. The human ships were not running, they were setting up. Each one was moving to a place from which it could support at least 2 other ships, creating overlapping angles that the HFY, focused on the direct advance, had not adjusted for. The chaos was constructed. The disorganization was a shape. The shooting started with 3 human ships hitting the lead HFY corvettes simultaneously from different angles. The HFY returned fire and pushed harder, driving toward what looked like a gap in the human formation, and walked directly into a crossfire from 2 destroyers that had been sitting quiet and dark at the edge of the asteroid field. One HFY cruiser went dead in space in 40 seconds. Briggs was quiet through all of this. He gave orders in a low voice, rarely more than a sentence at a time, and the bridge around him moved in response. Reyes was in a state of focused intensity that made her look like a different person, or perhaps the most complete version of the person she always was, brought out fully by the exact conditions that would have broken someone else. She was tracking 6 targets at once and firing in precise sequence, her hands steady, her voice even when she called out targeting data. Then things got harder. The HFY adapted faster than Veilcore expected. Their 6 heavy cruisers broke from the main formation and began moving in a flanking arc, a slow but significant repositioning that would, in approximately 9 minutes, put them in a position to hit the human fleet from a direction that none of the current positioning accounted for. Veilcore saw it on the display and looked at Briggs, expecting to see the captain reaching for a communication line to flag it to the other ships. Briggs had already seen it. He was already talking to 2 other captains in the quiet, rapid way they had, and within 90 seconds, 3 human ships had begun shifting to intercept, not on orders from the admiral, but from the captains themselves, reading the same board and responding before they were told to. Grace Okafor's voice came over the fleet channel a full minute later, confirming what they were already doing. The Iron Gate was pulled into the flank response. It put them in a difficult position between the shifting heavy cruisers and the ongoing main battle, taking fire from multiple sources while moving at speed through the edge of the asteroid field. The ship shook hard, twice. A console behind Veilcore sparked and went dark. Someone was shouting in the corridor outside the bridge, organized shouting, the kind that meant something was being handled. Garza's voice came through the comm from below, swearing continuously in a low mutter that somehow carried the same energy as a man solving a problem while also being very angry at the problem. Then, the power in the damaged section rerouted, and the main system stabilized, and Garza said only, "She's fine. Go." And then Nadia Holloway did something no one ordered her to do. Veilcore saw it on the side screen first. A boarding team launching from the Iron Gate's secondary bay, heading for one of the HFY heavy cruisers that had been partially disabled in the exchange. Holloway's marker moving fast across the screen toward a ship that was still functionally armed and crewed. Briggs saw it. He pressed the comm. "Holloway, Her voice came back immediately. Their command systems are still up. If we take out their fleet coordination from inside, the rest of the formation breaks. I've got a route through their damaged port section. A brief pause. I need 6 minutes, Captain. Briggs looked at the screen for 2 seconds. You have 5, he said. She took 4. The HFY heavy cruiser's command and coordination array went offline 8 minutes later. The effect rippled through the HFY formation, the way a single cut rope drops a whole system. Not all at once, but in a fast cascade. Ships that had been coordinating their firing solutions began making isolated decisions. 2 of them accidentally cut across each other's lines. The flanking arc collapsed into confusion. The HFY, suddenly stripped of cohesion, and facing a force that had not broken, despite every reasonable expectation that it should have, began the slow repositioning that meant retreat. It took another 40 minutes for the last HFY ship to clear the corridor. When it did, the Iron Gates bridge was very quiet. Vale Kor sat in his observation post and looked at the screen showing 14 human ships still holding position. Some of them were badly damaged. One was venting atmosphere from a torn section and moving on thrusters alone. But all 14 were there. He looked at Briggs. The captain was leaning forward in his chair, with his elbows on his knees, watching the last HFY signal fade from the display. His face was tired and completely calm. Vale Kor opened his log and tried to write something useful. He sat for a long time, with the cursor waiting. Eventually he wrote, 61 ships could not break 14. Not because of technology. Not because of numbers. Because every individual on every one of those 14 ships made a private decision at some point in the last 2 hours that they were not going to be the one who stopped. I cannot model that. I cannot predict it. I cannot build a counter-strategy for a force whose most powerful weapon is a decision made inside a person where no scan can reach. He paused, then added one more line. I no longer believe this war will go the way the Council expects. He saved the log and looked up. Somewhere in the decks below, someone was cheering. Then more voices joined in, spreading through the ship deck by deck. And Vale Kor sat in the middle of it, and felt, for the first time in his career, that he was the least dangerous being in the room. I was ordered to observe humans in battle. Now I know we cannot win. Vale Kor spent the return journey writing. He had never spent this long on a single report in his career. Most intelligence assessments he had written were clean, structured documents, observed behaviors cataloged, tactical patterns noted, probable threat levels assigned a number on the Dravathi scale. He had written dozens of them over the years, and they had all followed the same shape, because the shape was correct. Evidence, analysis, conclusion, recommendation. This one would not fit the shape. He tried 3 times to start it from the beginning in the standard format, and 3 times he stopped halfway through the first section, because the standard format kept reducing things that should not be reduced. It kept turning moments that had changed the way he understood the universe into bullet points. It kept making Marsh, sitting with a grieving young man, into a footnote about crew psychological management. It kept turning Holloway crossing open space in the middle of a battle into a tactical notation about marine initiative. He scrapped all 3 drafts. Then he sat back, looked at the ceiling of his small quarters for a while, and started again differently. He wrote the way a person writes when they have seen something they cannot stop thinking about. He wrote everything. He wrote about the alarm on day 3, and the way the Iron Gates crew moved toward it without hesitation. He wrote about Reyes and her firing solutions that the Dravathi tactical manual would have flagged as irrational. He wrote about Garza refusing to let the ship fall apart by sheer stubbornness, and what he had described as believing in the outcome. He wrote about Holloway, afraid every single time, going anyway, not despite the fear, but with it fully in hand, as though she had decided long ago that the fear was hers to carry and not hers to obey. He wrote about Greg and the 2 hours Calvin Marsh spent sitting beside him in a quiet room, doing nothing and everything at the same time. He wrote about Ben, who was allowed 4 hours in the communications bay to hear the first sound of a child he had never met, across light years, because Dana Reyes decided that this mattered, and acted on that decision without being asked. He wrote about the 14 ships that held the Varen Corridor against 61, and how the most decisive moment in that battle was a corporal making a choice in a fraction of a second, because it was the right thing to do, and she trusted herself enough to do it. He wrote about Briggs on the corridor floor, sitting against a wall, looking at nothing, saying, "Because they were ours," and meaning every word of it, in a way that contained entire worlds of meaning, that Veilcor was still unpacking weeks later. By the time the transport reached Dravathi space, the report was 340 pages long. He read it through once, he changed nothing. Counselor Thon received him in the same office, behind the same desk, with the same unhurried stillness he had always had. He looked at the file Veilcor placed on the desk, the real file, not a summary, and his eyes moved to the page count. "This is not a standard assessment," Thon said. "No," Veilcor said, "it is not." Thon looked at him with the careful expression of a very old, very intelligent being who has just noticed that something has changed in a person he thought he understood. He said, "I will read it." Veilcor nodded and left. He did not hear from Thon for 11 days. When the message finally came, it was short. "Your assessment has been noted. Your conclusions are considered the work of an observer who spent too long in proximity to the subjects. A corrected summary will be filed." Veilcor read that message twice. Then he sent one back, which he had never done before in response to a superior's dismissal. He sent back 3 words: "Read it again." He did not know if Thon would. But 3 other senior counselors had already requested copies, quietly and without explanation. The report was moving through the halls of the Intelligence Division in the way that true things sometimes move, not loudly, not officially, but from hand to hand in the dark. The conclusion of the report was what people kept talking about when they talked about it, in the careful, guarded way that Dravathi discussed things that made them uncomfortable. Veilcor had written that the Dravathi Collective had spent 6,000 years evaluating other species according to a single principle, that strength is what remains when weakness is removed. A strong soldier was one who had eliminated fear. A strong commander was one who had eliminated emotional bias. A strong species was one that had optimized its behavior toward survival outcomes and stripped away everything that did not serve that optimization. By every single one of those measurements, humanity scored poorly. They were afraid. They were emotional. They made decisions based on love and loyalty and stubbornness, rather than calculation. They were, by the Dravathi definition of the word, deeply and thoroughly compromised. But, he wrote, the Dravathi had been measuring the wrong thing. They had confused the removal of weakness with the creation of strength, and those were not the same thing. What they had actually created, over 6,000 years of optimization, were soldiers who were clean, efficient, rational, and alone, each one a complete instrument sealed off from every source of weight and connection. Humans were none of those things. Every human he had observed on the Iron Gate was carrying something. Marsh carried the grief of everyone around him and turned it into presence. Reyes carried loyalty like a debt she intended to pay. Garza carried the ship itself in his hands, personally, as if its survival were his own responsibility. Holloway carried fear into every fight, and refused to let it steer. Briggs carried the names of his dead, and read them every morning, because he had decided that was what being a captain meant. They were not clean instruments. They were human beings, loaded with everything, and they fought with the whole weight of it. And that weight, Vilecore wrote, was not a weakness. It was the engine. Every decision they made that defied calculation was made because they were calculating in a currency the Dravathi did not have a name for: each other. He ended the report with a single sentence. It was the only sentence in the entire document that he went back and rewrote several times, and in the end, he returned to the first version, because none of the others were as honest. He wrote, "I was ordered to observe humans in battle and report on their weaknesses. I have found none that function as weaknesses. I have found only the reasons why we cannot win." Somewhere on the other side of Dravathi space, the Iron Gate was still moving. It had been repaired as much as it could be repaired in the field, which meant it was still slightly battered and would need a full dry dock stay that it probably wouldn't get for months. Lou Garza had already identified 4 things about the patch job he wanted to redo properly and had told them to the ship's system in a voice that made clear he was holding a personal grudge against each one. Dana Reyes had new firing drills posted for the next 2 weeks. They were harder than the last set. Calvin Marsh had added 2 new names to the small board in the medical bay where he wrote things down, things he wanted to remember. He did not explain the board to anyone who asked. He just said it helped. Nadia Holloway was in the training bay. She was laughing again, which meant she was working. And Captain Aaron Briggs was sitting in his chair, with bad coffee going cold beside him, reading 2 names out loud to an empty bridge in a quiet voice: Kara and Pete. He read them the same way every morning, not as a ritual, not as a performance, but because he had decided that this was part of what it meant to lead people and then bring them home. And when you could not bring them home, you carried their names instead. The Iron Gate moved on. The Dravathi report, 340 pages long, sat on the desks of 4 senior counselors in the intelligence hall, passed between them without comment, without official acknowledgement, with only the shared quiet understanding of very old, very experienced beings who have just read something true. And somewhere in the margins of one copy, in the careful script of a Dravathi who had been changed by what he saw, someone had written just one word in the space beside the final sentence. The word was agreed.